Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. Imagine this for a second. You lose everything. Your job, your home, your family, your freedom. By every logical measure, you should be, well, completely broken, miserable. But what if, right in the middle of that total collapse, you claim to be happier than a king? Today, we're unpacking the mind of Samuel Rutherford, a man who sat in a cold 17th century Scottish prison and wrote letters claiming his stone cell was a palace. That the walls, and I'm quoting here, gleamed like rubies.
It's a fascinating paradox, isn't it? And we're not just looking at old theology today. We're really dissecting the anatomy of conviction, a belief so intense that it literally overrides physical reality. We're exploring how the human mind can build a palace out of an idea, specifically the idea of a God who becomes more real when everything else just vanishes.
It's the ultimate case study in resilience, or, I guess, obsession, depending on your perspective. We're going to dig into his letters, which are basically a log of this incredible psychological journey that, it challenges believers and skeptics alike. But before we get completely lost in the 1600s, just have a quick favor to ask. If you like my channel, please subscribe and press the like button.
It really does help us keep these deep dives going.
So let's set the scene. We're talking about the 1600s. Samuel Rutherford. He starts out as this dedicated pastor in a really small rural place called Anwath. He wasn't looking for fame or anything, just a shepherd.
That is the great irony of his life, yeah. Anwath was a tiny hamlet, and Rutherford was, by all accounts, deeply invested in the tiny details of his parishioners' lives. One source described him as constantly checking the spiritual pulse of his people, so he wasn't a celebrity. He was more like a clinician of the soul.
But he was also a man of massive intellect. And this was a time when having the wrong opinion could get you.
Well, yes. Exactly. And that's where the trouble starts. He gets banished, but not for a crime like, theft or something. It was for nonconformity.
Nonconformity. What does that even mean in this context?
Right. To get this, you have to understand the political landscape. The king, Charles I, wanted to standardize the church. He wanted this top-down structure episcopacy. The king appoints bishops. The bishops rule the church. It's like a corporate hierarchy. The CEO has all the power.
And Rutherford was on the other team, a Presbyterian.
Exactly. He believed in a bottom-up structure, elders chosen by the people, not appointed by the king. He basically told the king, you stay in your lane, God handles the church.
Which kings generally hate to hear.
They despise it.
Yeah.
So in 1636, the High Commission Court just dropped the hammer. They didn't execute him, though. They did something more, let's say, strategic. They tried to cancel him. They banished him to Aberdeen.
Aberdeen. The sources call it a place of cold northern love.
That sounds awful. It was a calculated punishment. Aberdeen was a stronghold of the king's supporters. He was sent there to be isolated, mocked. But the cruelest part of the sentence was the gag order. He was strictly forbidden to preach.
And from his letters, that silence seems to be the thing that nearly broke him. He calls them his dumb Sabbaths.
That phrase, dumb Sabbaths, is just so heavy. For Rutherford, preaching wasn't just a job. It was how he breathed, how he processed the world. He called himself a dry tree during this time, completely useless.
It's like being completely deplatformed in the 17th century. You have the message, the passion, but the mute button is permanently on.
Precisely. And the psychological toll of that is what makes what happens next so remarkable. Because he couldn't speak to a crowd, he started writing to individuals. To a noblewoman, Lady Kenmure, who struggled with depression. To a merchant's wife, Marion McNaught. Even to teenagers. And because he's writing one-on-one, the content becomes incredibly intimate.
It's almost like the pressure of the silence is what created the diamonds. If he'd kept preaching, the words would have just vanished. But because he was silenced, we have these letters.
And the letters offer this radical reframing of suffering. This is where we get into the God focus of our deep dive. Most of us, religious or not, we see suffering as a glitch, something that went wrong. Rutherford saw it as a wooing.
A wooing, like a courtship. That is a very strange way to talk about being in prison.
It is, but follow his logic. He believed we're all naturally addicted to idols. Comfort, status, family, freedom. He believed God strips those things away, not to be cruel, but to clear the room. So God is basically saying, okay, now that everyone else is gone, you and I need to talk.
There's a metaphor he uses that I really want to unpack. The black tree.
Yes, the black tree or the crab tree of the cross. He admits that suffering, symbolized by the cross, looks terrifying. It looks like a dead weight that's going to crush you.
But then he completely flips the physics of it.
He does. He writes that if you actually pick up that burden, if you accept the suffering, it changes properties. He says it becomes wings to a bird or sails to a ship.
I love that image, but let's push back on it a bit. A bird needs wings to fly, but the wings have weight. Sails add drag. Is he saying the resistance is actually the propulsion?
That is exactly it. It's the concept of anti-fragility, just centuries before we had a word for it. He's arguing that the human soul is designed to bear weight, specifically the weight of reliance on God. Without that weight, without the cross, you don't have the sails to catch the wind, you just drift. The suffering provides the structure for motion.
That is a powerful idea, that the thing you think is destroying you is actually the engine. But he takes it even further with what I'm calling the half-mind argument.
This is pure theology, but it has a huge psychological payoff. Rutherford argues that when a believer suffers, they are never, ever suffering alone. He quotes the scripture, "He is afflicted in all our afflictions." And he interprets this to mean that Christ literally carries the heavy end of the cross.
So the person suffering only has the light end.
Right. It completely transforms the experience. It's not solitary confinement anymore. It's a partnership. If you believe the creator of the universe is shoulder to shoulder with you, lifting the heavy end, well, the pain isn't meaningless. It's a shared project.
But let's ground this a little. It's one thing to talk about wings and sails when you're just having a bad day. Rutherford dealt with real tragedy. The sources say he lost his wife, Eupham Hamilton, and he lost almost all of his children.
He did. Only one daughter outlived him. He knew death intimately.
So how does this theology hold up against the death of a child? Because reading his letters, he uses this idea of borrowed goods that, honestly, it feels a little cold at first.
It can feel that way to a modern reader, for sure. We see our children as ours. Rutherford had a strictly theistic worldview. God is the owner of everything. We're just tenants. We're just borrowing.
So in his mind, when a child dies, it's not a robbery.
No. He sees it as the owner calling in a loan. He even writes about making restitution to God, returning what was lent to him.
I have to play the skeptic here. Is that genuine resilience, or is that just a defense mechanism, a way to dissociate from the grief? It wasn't mine anyway.
A very valid question. But if you read the letters, he isn't stoic. He weeps. He feels the agony, but his interpretation of the agony is what's different. He refuses to accuse God of theft. It's a kind of submission that actually frees him from bitterness. If you never claimed ultimate ownership, you can't be destroyed when the asset is returned.
It's a brutal kind of freedom. But it leads to this incredibly intense emotional state he enters in prison. You'd expect a Calvinist theologian to be dry, logical, maybe a bit cold. Rutherford sounds like a teenager in love.
He absolutely does. He leans so heavily on the Song of Solomon. He uses romantic, almost erotic language to describe his relationship with God.
He talks about love sickness. He describes Christ's love as a sea he wants to drown in over head and ears. It's so visceral.
It's the language of excess. He doesn't want a reasonable amount of religion. He wants to be overwhelmed. There's this one passage where he wishes he had paper as broad as heaven and earth and ink as the sea, just to write down how valuable Christ is.
And this is where that palace in the prison idea comes from. He isn't hallucinating. He's just hyper-focused.
Exactly. When he calls his prison Christ's palace, he's asserting that God's presence is more real than the stone walls. He says the stones gleam like rubies. To us, he's in a dungeon. To him, he's in the throne room because the king is there with him.
It really highlights the difference between circumstance and reality. But, and this is important, he wasn't always on that spiritual high. The sources show he really struggled. He wasn't a robot.
No, and that's the human element that makes him so trustworthy. He writes about feeling dead, dry, withered. He calls himself a waster of grace.
He calls this Satan's sieve.
Yes, the idea that you have to be shaken to separate the wheat from the chaff. And this brings us to a really profound point, I think, about belief versus atheism.
Oh, so?
Well, the core struggle for Rutherford in those dark moments is the silence of God, that feeling that he's just talking to the ceiling. For an atheist or a skeptic, that silence is the answer. It means there's no one there. You're alone.
Right. The silence is evidence of the void.
But Rutherford interprets that silence completely differently. He sees it as a hiding of the face. It's a test of the relationship, not proof of absence. He has this incredible line where he says, "I will believe in the dark upon luck's head."
Upon luck's head. What does that mean?
It means he's going to trust the bond, the relationship he has with God, even when all the immediate data, his feelings, the silence, tells him he's been abandoned. He's betting on the history of the relationship over the feeling of the moment.
That's a fascinating distinction. The skeptic trusts the data, the silence. Rutherford trusts the bond.
Exactly. And that mental discipline is what allowed him to survive those dumb Sabbaths without losing his mind.
So speaking of surviving, he doesn't die in Aberdeen, right?
No, the political winds shifted. The Covenanters rose to power, the bishops were kicked out, and Rutherford was released. He went back to Anwath for a bit, but then became a professor at St. Andrews. He even went to London to help write the shorter catechism.
He became a real heavyweight. And we have to mention his book, Lex Rex. We said earlier he believed the king was overstepping. Lex Rex is where he put that into a weaponized format.
Yes, Lex Rex means the law is king. This was revolutionary. The standard view was Lex the king is law. The king does what he wants because he's God's anointed.
And Rutherford just flipped it on its head.
Completely. He argued the law comes from God, and the
Yeah.
king is subject to that law just like everyone else. And if the king breaks the law, the people have a right to resist. This was just treasonous dynamite. It's the grandfather of modern democracy.
So he wasn't just a mystic writing love letters. He was actively dismantling the divine right of kings.
He was. And the monarchy never forgave him. When Charles II came back to the throne, the government hunted him down. They burned Lex Rex. They stripped him of his titles. And Parliament summoned him to answer for treason.
Which we know meant a show trial and then an execution.
Almost certainly. But Rutherford was already dying. He was on his deathbed when the summons came.
And this is where we get that final moment of defiance. The man who found a palace in a prison wasn't going to be scared by a parliament.
Not at all. When the messengers arrived, he reportedly told them, "I have got a summons already from a higher judge in council. I will be where few kings and great folks come."
He basically told them, I answer to the CEO, not to middle management.
Exactly. And his final words have echoed through the centuries since. Glory, glory dwelleth in Emmanuel's land.
Emmanuel's land, the place he'd already been living in mentally since that prison cell in Aberdeen.
That's the key. He didn't just go there when he died. He had been living there the whole time. That's why the prison couldn't break him, because he wasn't really in the prison.
So let's wrap this up. We've looked at the politics, the black tree, the borrowed children. What's the big takeaway for us today?
I think it comes back to the definition of freedom. Rutherford challenges us to ask, is my happiness dependent on my circumstances? Or is it rooted in something that can't be taken away from me?
We usually think we need things to be okay. You know, a good job, our health, our freedom.
And Rutherford proves that a human mind, fueled by a single overpowering conviction, can find total freedom in total confinement. It really forces us to look at our own lives and ask, what do we love so much that it could turn a prison into a palace?
That is the question. And I want to leave you with one final provocative thought from the sources. We talked about his view that we are all borrowed. Rutherford said we are borrowed things living in borrowed houses.
It's a haunting idea to end on.
It is. So ask yourself this. If the owner called in the loan today on your house, your family, your life, what would you have left that is truly yours?
That's the only thing that matters in the end.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. We'll see you next time.